All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Janie Montblanc, and with me is Corey Gooker, our co-coordinator. And on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled A 40-Year Perspective on Fire Rehabilitation and Restoration in the Great Basin. Our very own Mike Pellant is presenting today, sharing his perspective on Great Basin ecosystem management gained over his long career with the Bureau of Land Management. Before I introduce Mike, I'll go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom Meeting as our platform with attendees' mics and cameras off. We will use the chat for questions, so please type in your questions at any time and I'll field them after the presentation. And after the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion and probably won't even take up the full hour and a half. So we're looking forward to this. Okay, now I'd like to welcome our presenter. Mike Pellant is a retired rangeland ecologist with the Bureau of Land Management in Boise. He started his career in 1976 with the Phase 1 watershed crew in southeast Utah, following the Federal Land and Policy Management Act of that same year. His career has spanned the environmental era, the sagebrush rebellion, wildfires and rehabilitation programs, more fires, more rehabilitation programs, and the age of partnerships and cooperation. He's worked internationally, assisting land management agencies as part of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and worked on every continent except Antarctica. He's one of the original founders of this Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and served as PI for 6 years. And so much more that we'll get to hear about in this webinar. So thank you very much, Mike, for sharing your career perspective with us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all the participants that are here. So, as Janice said, I'm going to go through kind of some highlights from the last 40 years in my career. Um, Sorry, just getting the technology. So what I'd like to focus on is kind of going from the progression from introduced species to native species over the years. To do this, I'm going to go back in history to when we first started planting crested wheatgrass and kind of use the fire rehabilitation program as how we show how policy changed over the years. But the other important message in this is the value of and importance of the collaboration and science management partnerships that we put together in the Great Basin. And again, this is kind of my experience and perspective. I'm not going to talk about all of the good things that were done in the Great Basin, just from the amount of time, but there were a lot of others involved in these efforts. And what I'm showing you couldn't have been accomplished without them as well. So, like I said, first I'll kind of do a historical perspective on land rehabilitation and introduce the native plants, environmental area, and then end up in the 80s through the 2000s on kind of where we are today. So I'll go way back when John Fremont traveled through the Great Basin, 1845, no wood, no water, no grass, the gloomy Artemisia, the prevailing shrub. So this was how at least early explorers saw the Great Basin. Kind of start the journey with European settlement in this area with livestock. There was no control over the livestock, and combine that with the introduction of cheatgrass in the late 1800s to early 1900s. Cheatgrass seed was probably brought over in grain seed that was planted from Europe. The railroads, when they started coming in, kind of served as a conduit to spread cheatgrass as well. So once it was here, it was pretty much here to stay. Kind of the early solution was crested wheatgrass, kind of the first areas that were considered a problem was abandoned farmlands. And science kind of stepped up and found this grass called crested wheatgrass. It was pretty easy to seed in the abandoned wheatlands because agricultural drills could be used. Just point of interest, 1932 was the first use of crested wheatgrass in Idaho. I think it was used a little earlier in some of the other Great Basin states. Well, white crested wheatgrass was adapted, good seed production, competes very well with weeds, soil production, which is especially important on abandoned cropland, and probably one of the most desirable characteristics, it was palatable and could withstand heavy livestock grazing. Always like this photo. If you look on left, the person in the field looks pretty well fed, and on the right side of the fence, doesn't look quite as well fed. So I think there was a little advertising going on, even in the early scientific literature. We move forward to 1946, Taylor Grazing Act. Was kind of realized at that point that had something had to be done by the unrestricted grazing. So this law was passed to number of reasons, promote more orderly use of the range, but also improvement of the range to stabilize livestock industry. The same year, the Department of Interior's Grazing Service and the General Land Office were merged into the Bureau of Land Management. And the early logo kind of indicates what the priorities were. I think you can see a miner, a livestockman, oil and gas. So it was pretty much looking not so much at the resource as important as the resource itself, but what it could support. Moving forward, get into the 1940s and 50s, kind of the range improvement area, sagebrush was considered a weed, and the answer was to replace it with crested wheatgrass. This 1951 BLM publication is pretty much about it. It's not restoring the federal range, it's rebuilding it. Science was certainly stepped into this and provided a lot of good information on equipment, this broadcast seeding. And as you can see on the photo on the right, it even incorporated, the discs to control the sagebrush, and then broadcast seeders on top of the mechanism to seed the crested wheatgrass. It's one of my favorite photos found in the project files in the Elko BLM office. This was a float in the 4th of July parade, 1949. It's a little hard to see, but on the side of the float, it says sagebrush to grass. The front of the float has some sagebrush. The back has crested wheatgrass. This was kind of the era of the golden grass of the West. This was pretty much the only rehabilitation species used for the most part, and soon there were many monocultures of crested wheatgrass throughout the Great Basin. Um, Farm drills didn't work well on the type of land that a lot of the rangeland was. So rangeland drills, the Forest Service created a prototype in 51. And then by 1955, a rangeland seeding committee, the range seeding committee, which was land management agencies, academia, and even the Society for Range Management at that time involved, developed the rangeland drill. And some of these drills are still in use today. Another driver was halogeton, which was a poisonous rangeland weed, especially poisonous to sheep. And crested wheatgrass, again, was a good control measure. So there was money appropriated by Congress to go out into these areas of heavy halogeton and replace it with crested wheatgrass. Even back then, the value of crested wheatgrass was noted in terms of its fire ability to resist fire. This was back in 1949 in southern Idaho. And you kind of see the outline there where the grazed crested wheatgrass and the fire burned around that. And so anyway, just another value of crested wheatgrass that we'll talk about more later. And just kind of looking back, A.C. Hall Jr., 1973, did kind of a retrospective look at crested wheatgrass trials and native species and found that native species failed in almost half of the trials in terms of establishing, whereas the introduced wheatgrass had only failed in two of the 248 trials they evaluated. So it kind of speaks to kind of this perception at that time that native species shouldn't be used because they couldn't be established well. So crested wheatgrass was kind of the default. So the environmental area, 1970s had the National Environmental Policy Act, T&E Species Act, the FLPMA, Federal Land Policy Management Act, 1976, and Public Rangeland Improvement Act, 78, were both very important pieces of legislation that kind of turned the tide from all crested wheatgrass to looking at what our other values were and how we could support and improve those. As Janice said, it was also the year I started with BLM out of college, southeastern Utah, doing phase one watershed inventories and serving as a range conservationist in a field office in southeastern Utah. So just to highlight a couple of things in the Federal Land Policy Management Act, they really stress looking at ecological and environmental values. The natural condition of some areas should be preserved. Public Rangeland Improvement Act to, I think importantly, improve the condition of the public rangelands. So they're feasible for all rangeland values in accordance with both Management Action Act objectives and the land use plans. And so now we're kind of focusing more on not just the use, but on other values such as wildlife habitat and recreation. And I think that's kind of a key to setting the stage for the use of more native species. So how did this era affect again, the fire rehabilitation program and the progression in use of native plants on federal lands? So prior to 1984, kind of summarizing, the policy was rehabilitate burned areas, basically to prevent soil erosion. That was the goal. Reseed burned areas with inexpensive perennial forb and shrub species. That's, I think, speaks to another reason why crested wheatgrass was used. And also going so far as to say crested wheatgrass is not considered an exotic, so it's okay to plant it. Um, After that, well, I'll kind of move back. I moved from Utah to the Bruno Resource Area, south in the Boise area, 1981, and I was supervisory range con here for about 7 years. But what I got into when I came here, I'm from Kansas originally, hadn't really had much experience with cheatgrass, wildfires, those issues. But this sign on the right was put out by Stinker gas stations back in the 1950s. And it says sagebrush is free, stuff some in your car. Obviously, there's no sagebrush left on this landscape now. The sign put it up, it was probably solid stand of sagebrush. So times had really changed in a fairly short period of time with what we called the cheatgrass wildfire cycle. Um, One thing, just being in the field office, I also assisted in fire suppression as a resource advisor. And this was a lightning storm over Mountain Home. It was picture was taken by the lookout tower at Bennett Mountain. This started fires all over the Snake River Plain in southwestern Idaho. I got up. They asked me to go out south of the Snake River because nobody could see through the smoke, see if there were any fires in that area. And about halfway between Mountain Home and the Nevada border, there was this fire called the Wickahoney Fire. I was the only one out there. I kind of monitored it, slept through the night, and woke up the next morning. And the Wickahoney State Stop, which was constructed in 1895 and was withstood the test of time until the fire. And as you can see, it didn't fare too well. So again, kind of a moment of where just looking at fire suppression alone isn't the answer because we don't have enough fire resources with these big lightning storms come through and start numerous fires. So what are other solutions? Same time, 1985, I started getting involved with the BLM's Emergency Fire Rehab Program as the Idaho representative. And we started changing the way we looked at fires and the fire rehabs in that we established these programmatic normal fire rehabilitation plans, which is a more generic rehab plan that individual plans could be tiered to. Critical thing here was looking at land use plans, using the objectives in them in developing rehab species that we would use. The compromise was some browse species okay if the seed wasn't above $5 a pound, annual precip above, had to be annual precipitation above 12 inches. But again, this idea of seeding fire-resistant vegetation it wasn't just erosion now, it was an objective that if the vegetation that will establish is unacceptable, we could use fire rehab funds to reestablish more fire-resistant plants and then monitoring for 3 growing seasons. So at that same year, Idaho BLM started a program called the Intermountain Green Stripping and Rehabilitation Program. And the purpose of this program was to start implementing green strips, which were strips or bands of fire-resistant vegetation at strategic locations with a goal to either slow or stop the wildfires, but also because we were looking at land use plans and knew that we were going to be needing more native species to meet some of the wildlife objectives. We had a program to increase the availability of native and introduced species for post-fire rehabilitation. Green stripping, as mentioned before, it's not a new concept. In fact, Platt and Jackson in 1946 basically defined it as break up cheatgrass areas with strips of fire-resistant vegetation, such as crested wheatgrass. And that was early on, we employed a lot of crested wheatgrass in our green stripping. Just give you one example. This was a fire again between Mountain Home and the Nevada border. The green strip was along the highway and around a road, and 5 of the 6 miles where we had a green strip, the fire stopped and did not cross. In this particular example, had it crossed the road, there was a good stand of sagebrush on the other side of the road that would have probably been lost and would have taken a lot more effort in terms of suppressing this fire. So again, I think the other thing here is this is spring grazing, so the grazing on the crested reduced fuels as well within the crested wheatgrass, which was probably instrumental in slowing or stopping the fire. Forage kochia. I'll talk more about where this was done. This was some studies that the Shrub Sciences Lab conducted. They had, I think, about 17 different sources of forage kochia, did some extensive testing on resistance to burning, resprouting after burning, and the immigrant variety of forage kochia proved to probably best meet all of those criteria. And so we've used forage kochia in green stripping. From my perspective, it's probably the best species that we have. Having said that, we also have to be careful because it can spread from where it's seeded. And we need to be cognizant of that in the areas that we put it into. And just one example here of 3 times I've seen forage kochia fires along Interstate 84 burn through the right-of-way, which now has a fair amount of forage kochia in it as well. and just stop in the green strip. So it certainly can be effective. Not saying that green stripping is effective in every situation. Sometimes just slowing the fire is an advantage in terms of suppression, getting out and being able to control the fire. So to kind of summarize, the green strip program started in 1987, and for the next 6 years, we established 451 miles of green strips in Idaho. Also did some pilot green strip projects in Oregon, Utah, and Nevada. Uh, a key thing with the green stripping, I had a monitoring crew out of the state office that did monitoring for anywhere from 2 to 3 years on all of the green strips. So we wanted to know how well would they establish and how long would they persist. The files, I made 2 copies and one went out to the field offices, but I kept a copy of all of the green strip files, the monitoring files, and USGS in Boise has them now, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation if you're interested in those files. So the other component of the green stripping program was the Intermountain Green Stripping and Rehabilitation Research Project. If you look under the long term, we wanted to develop procedures and plant materials to restore perennial vegetation. We did this a number of ways. I'm going to talk just specifically about the orchard experimental area that we established in 1988 to evaluate plant materials, both native and introduced. So we set aside 240 acres of BLM land. This is kind of midway between Boise and Mountain Home, south of Interstate 84. You see, there's more cooperators than this, but the Forest Service Shrub Sciences Lab, NRCS had demonstration nursery and did some of their inter-center strain trials. ARS in Boise looked at seed matrix priming to seed into cheatgrass. ARS Logan had some of their plant materials tested. So a number of them, I won't go through everything, but this site is still available for research, and USGS and with the assistance of Rocky Mountain Research Station are kind of in charge of the research that goes on in this area. However, I do want to mention the importance of Steve Monson. He was been my mentor from when I started in Boise District in 1981 and have worked with him all through the years. He was pretty instrumental in a lot of this native plant development. One illustration here, he put in 17 different sources of blue bunch wheatgrass grass across the Great Basin to evaluate which ones work best in this dry environment. The Anatone blue bunch wheatgrass, which is now a release that's available, was selected in part based on its performance out here. One of the real promising things about the Anatone variety was that it actually recruited into some of the cheatgrass around these plots that it was originally established in. So let's look at native species. The 1980s, we saw kind of a slight increase in native species use since the fire rehab policy would allow it. The native shrub that the increase in it was primarily four-winged saltbush brush because it was palatable to livestock. So it was still some, I mean, it was a good native shrub, but it also had value from a livestock grazing standpoint. So just one example, Delmar Vail was the Idaho State BLM director at the time, and Delmar had started his career back in the crested wheatgrass era, was receptive to planting natives, but with sagebrush, he had some concerns. Could you really establish it? So we did a little trial out in the Snake River Birds of Prey area, did a light harrow on an area that had burned the year before, broadcast sagebrush seed. And kind of the interesting observation was about 90% of the sagebrush that established was in the compaction area where the wheel had went through. So this was a kind of interesting finding, but we had a range conservationist over in the Jarbidge field office that came up with the idea to use a fertilizer drop spreader with a chain behind it and a vine roll cultipacker to simulate what we did with the cedar, and was pretty successful in a number of projects establishing sagebrush using this technology. So I think it's just one thing I'd encourage all of you is, just think outside the box sometimes. And some of these ideas, you don't know till you test them, but there could be some real progress made with seeding technology and other aspects of restoration. I'm going to move forward to 1999. This was a large fire year in the Great Basin, 1.7 million acres burned. The Nevada State Director at the time was Bob Abbey. He had the vision to say, we need to look at this not as a problem in just an area with a fire and with rehabilitation, but we need a landscape approach. And that landscape approach was what we called the Great Basin Restoration Initiative. Again, I kind of stepped in on this one and was an interim coordinator for a while until I was selected to be the lead. But this was kind of a big step forward. And again, if we really look at the reason the fire, the trend had certainly been over the past 20 years or so of not only increasing wildfires, but larger wildfires. So, what could we do that's proactive before all of these fires occur? The first step was to do extensive outreach about support for Great Basin restoration initiatives from universities, various interest groups. The tribes were consulted, a whole lot of state and federal agencies, political representatives as well. And there was general, just widespread support to, institute this kind of a program across the Great Basin. So we started 1999, came up with a publication called Out of Ashes an Opportunity, which kind of described the problem and talked about some different things that could be done. And then 2000, Healing the Land, which was basically the blueprint or the strategy that we were proposing to move forward. Important for BLM because if you look at the total acreage of BLM in the Great Basin, it's just over half the total acreage. So, but having said that, partners were important. Again, this was a landscape approach, not just a BLM approach. So the vision of the Great Basin was healthy Great Basin landscapes and sustainable resources that meet the needs of the public that use and enjoy these lands. Uh, the strategy kind of saw it as a one-stop shop. We would assist with planning, we would obtain the implementation funding, assist with inventory assessment, monitoring, promote the science delivery needed to do it, and do all the collaboration coordination. A lot of that could be done. The one thing that didn't arrive, well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Goals. So the two main goals were protect existing healthy lands, and then secondarily, then restore strategically. And it's somewhat similar to the kind of the protect the core, grow the core concept that's being used now in some of the sagebrush steppe ecosystems. And again, the fire rehab policy changes were made in light of this, and this was the first time that the use of native species is recommended with some limitations, cost being the primarily one. And then also that you could implement green stripping in a burn area or for a short area outside. And the rationale there was too often we would do a rehabilitation project, would have a fire, and the non-fire tolerant plants in that restoration project would be lost. And so, how could we help maybe in the future reduce the risk of losing the gains we made in the fire rehabilitation seeding? So native plant use, look at 1999 with this change in policy. The total, this is just total grass forb and shrub species, but pretty impressive change just basically overnight with that change in policy. And it continued, even after 99 into 2000, 2001. Um, oh, yeah. Another big thing was that remember, kind of it was all about erosion early on, and now we changed it to where you could apply herbicides to control noxious weeds and cheatgrass and fund that through the ESR program, which gave us the ability then to treat with an herbicide in a burned cheatgrass area and then reseed with a lot more potential for success than just seeding into the cheatgrass area after it burned. National Fire Plan came along shortly after. It did include implementation funding. And so, it had some components that were very close to what we had in the Great Basin Restoration Initiative to restore and ensure a future where healthy land reduced wildfire risk. So bottom line, this was some of the beginnings of where we were getting some funding to implement the on-the-ground restoration treatments in the Great Basin. And we also kind of followed up from the native plant project associated with the green stripping program and kind of by having the Great Basin Restoration Initiative, it kind of put the program on steroids. Really saw more money coming in on this and working with our partners, especially Rocky Mountain Research Station. This whole idea of going from seed collection, doing the evaluations, getting the seed increased, getting it in the hands of growers, improving the seeding technology, and then getting a better opportunity to get uh, a result in healthy native plant communities. So new seeding technology, we worked with some of the private industry. This is a Truax Rough Rider drill. And what we looked at with this is putting the native forbs on where the compression wheels are behind the seed tube, and then in between the disc openers and put the native grass. As you can see, it's a little hard to see, but in the areas where the compression wheels were used, globe mallow, yarrow, penstemon, sagebrush all did really well. And in the furrowed areas, the native grass, the blue bunch wheatgrass came in. So pretty encouraging that, there is technology other than just the rangeland drill that's going to help us do a better job to get the full complement of native species that we seeded established. I just throw this in. The list is hard to read, but just to kind of illustrate that there was a lot of native forb shrub grasses that were evaluated for restoration potential. The more favorable ones were then brought into this cycle of that I showed before to get them into seed increase, get them into growers' hands, get them on the ground. So again, there's a lot of uh, cooperators that I didn't mention in this effort, and just listed some of them here. But one thing I do have is all of the progress reports from both this and the green stripping, and we're going to make those available. I'll talk about that in a minute. Uh, One other, I guess, program that really helped was fiscal year 2001 and '03 appropriations. Um, Told the agencies to develop a long-term program to supply native plant materials and set up an interagency native plant conservation initiative. And in BLM, the group Peggy Olwell and that team, again, was a great source of both income and input in making the Great Basin Restoration Initiative's native plant program so productive. kind of finishing up now the Healthy Lands Initiative of BLM. Again, more funds that went into restoration. Again, Great Basin Restoration Initiative wasn't the funder, but we provided the technical assistance if needed and helped link the science to the management to do the restoration. And kind of close on the cooperation collaboration. There was a number of different regional or Great Basin-wide efforts during this time. We put together what we call the Great Basin Consortium so we could keep everybody informed of what was being done in each of these partnerships or programs. And I think that was important that again, so we could all work together. We all had our different areas we were focusing on or skill sets, but together we made a lot bigger difference than just trying to individually work outside of everyone else. Now I'll just kind of close with a couple of slides. As Janice said, the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. To me, this is one of the most impressive partnerships that has evolved out of the Great Basin and just providing management with the science to improve restoration, fire rehabilitation has, I think, just been essential for the growth that we've seen in, applying the new techniques, applying the new findings, science findings into our restoration rehabilitation programs. So kudos to Janie and Corey and Lisa as the principal investigator for all of the work they're doing on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. Lessons learned. I mean, these are pretty much spoken to already. The partnership and collaboration are essential for any type of a rehabilitation or restoration program that we're doing in the Great Basin. Again, that strong science and management connection is just critical. And again, Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, others. I mean, everybody now, I think the links between science and management has grown stronger and stronger over the years. And I think that's a blessing and it's critical for success. And another thing, just as individuals, be innovative, be part of the solution. Remember the sagebrush cedar that the range conservationist out of Jarbidge saw a problem and just followed it through. So just encourage you all to kind of look at a problem as an opportunity. So as I mentioned, I've got electronic copies of a lot of the progress reports and Janie, we've talked about we will get those posted on the Great Basin Restoration Initiative, or I'm sorry, on the Fire Science Exchange website in the near future. The green strip monitoring files, if any researchers are interested, again, are at the USGS office in Boise. Michelle Jeffries is a contact there. I've seen a lot of research published on green stripping here in the past few years. And I think this is a resource that could be very valuable given the number of replication we have in terms of green strips that were established and all of the data that goes back 20, 25 years in some cases. And I'm still a volunteer with BLM with Karen Prentice as a National Science Coordinator for BLM. However, can also contact me through my private email and private phone number. I'm always available if you've got questions or any way I can help. I'd like to do that. So I'm just closing with a quote from Aldo Leopold, um, basically saying that cheatgrass is a challenge to rectify. It is a challenge, and he found that this challenge was or just a hopeless attitude about making progress on cheatgrass. And I think if he was alive today, the statement would be very different. I think we've made tremendous progress in terms of cheatgrass, wildfire cycle, rehabilitation, restoration after those kind of events. So let's just keep moving forward. Last, I retired officially in 2014, and GBRI kind of moved into the newer Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative. But this is the last slide, and I'll just end there. And if there are any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing your long view perspective. It's really nice to see where we've been, where we come from, and where we are, and how much has been accomplished. That's great. Yay!
Thank you.
Um, yeah, and to the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, I think I saw Jean in the audience too. Thank you to you and Jean for starting the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. So, uh, yeah. You've done a lot in your career. We appreciate it. Yeah, so let's see. Does anyone have any questions? If so, please type them in the chat. If you have questions for Mike about, drills or yeah, what's the best equipment or about green stripping, forage kochia, any other questions, please go ahead and ask. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, Mike, I wanted to ask you about your like visioning. What do you think is the vision of the future of land management in the Great Basin? Where do you think the land is going?
Well, my vision is it's going to get more difficult. I think with climate change, we're seeing more fires, bigger fires. We're seeing invasive species that their range is shifting. For example, yellow star thistle was primarily in northern Idaho, and it's now in the Boise foothills. So I think the challenges are increasing, but I also think that the science and the dedication, it's going to be a battle, but we've won those battles before, and I think we will win in the future. It's not going to be easy, but the alternative of doing nothing is not acceptable.
Great. All right. We don't have too big of a group, so I'll try to, people have their hands raised. I'll try to unmute them. So go ahead, Brian.
Cool. Thank you. Um, hey, Mike, thanks for putting this on. I really appreciate it. Um, I thought I'd ask a long rambling question instead of typing a long rambling question. But I started my career in the Great Basin in 1999, and so I've kind of only known the Great Basin Initiative. I did get to watch it develop and grow into what it is today, which is incredible. And I think I took for granted at the time, and still maybe do, the importance of like consensus building and social capital, the relationships you kind of talked on, and making this arg I mean, the argument that doing nothing isn't an option is 100% true, but like it's not an easy sell always because it costs money and sacrifice and stuff. And I'm curious about some of those early challenges and how, you tackled this, you and others tackled this big problem of getting all these diverse groups together towards we can't just do nothing. It's not worth it. I know that's a big question, but I'm kind of curious how that developed early on.
Yeah, yeah, Brian. No, that's a great question. And what I found is it was not difficult pulling people together because I recognized the problem, knew that individually or as a group or whatever, they couldn't fix it themselves. And so this collaborative approach really wasn't that difficult to put together. I can't remember anybody saying, we're doing our thing. You just go ahead. We'll continue what we're doing. Everybody wanted to pull together. So yeah, that's one of the more positive and more I don't know if one of the things about this that both surprised me, but yet still uh, just was a lot of fulfillment from seeing everybody pulling together, especially when we had these different five or so different entities all separate, but we all had a niche. And as we talked about it, we talked about how we can fill this niche. And Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, a great example, coming on board with it as well. I didn't have the slides showing them, but they were an early member of that bigger group as well. And so science delivery, well, here we go. So yeah, it wasn't difficult. There was a common cause and just pretty easy to pull people together.
Awesome. Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks for the great question. Mark Brunson in the chat says, Mike, we've seen that a key driver of the increase in fires is the Great Basin, example on the Snake River Plain, is human population growth. Do you see a way to increase the role of the public in both reducing fires and improving our restoration efforts? To say it another way, if people are part of the problem, can they be part of the solution?
Yeah, great question, Mark, and good to hear from you. Um, Yeah, what I found that this whole Firewise effort, I'm just speaking now my experience in the Boise area, is really opening people's eyes to these issues. And probably the biggest driver of interest is that not only insurance rates are going higher, but people in the urban and wildland interface are losing insurance. Insurance companies are reducing risks by just dropping those areas. But if you have the Firewise, a good example here is Avamore, is a community in the Boise foothills, and it's a totally Firewise community. And the siding, the shingles are fire resistant, very little landscaping, no juniper, no, and I think that's kind of the solution is moving forward on the urban wildland interface. And I think the public is getting it because it hits at their pocketbook now if their insurance rates go up or if they lose their insurance. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but I think there's certainly more interest in being Firewise than there used to be, especially in the Boise, wildland urban interface for sure.
I'll just make a little plug that I just made my neighborhood Firewise, and you have some little hurdles, but if anyone wants to do that in their neighborhood, I can help out. So give me a call or email anytime. Like Mike said, it's really important. I think neighbors are going to be a big part of the solution. Okay, Jean, I saw your hand up and then it went back down, but I'll click the unmute button if you wanted to come on.
Sure. First, thanks, Mike. Thanks for moving us all forward for all those years. That was a great overview. My question kind of relates back to Janie's and its visioning. Where do you think we should be focusing our attention right now, especially given more limited research dollars?
Yeah, great question. Uh, yeah, I guess my vision before I do that, my fear is I think what you're saying is that this problem is constantly evolving with the climate change and with new species, invasive species. Without the science, we're going to go step backward, not forward. But my vision would just be we've had hurdles in the past and we've overcome them and we've moved forward. So it's still, to me, it can be two steps forward. There might be one step back, but there's going to be two steps forward after that. So just, keeping a positive mind, doing the best you can in the hard times. But yeah, I'm really concerned right now that we will lose a fair amount of ground if we don't have the science to address these problems as they grow and as they, morph into a bigger problem. So uh, my glass has always been half full. It still is, but it's not as full as it used to be.
Well, hopefully we'll get back there, like you said, 2 steps forward. That great question. Thanks. Megan in the chat says, "Thank you, Mike. I'm curious to hear your perspective on collaboration partnerships and what has been the most durable across different administrations, policy changes, and agency structures over time."
Yeah, another great question. The collaboration, a lot of it, the success has to do with the relationships that are built during that collaboration. And I think one thing, my whole career, the collaboration has worked best when you've already got a relationship and you build upon those relationships. A quick example, back in 1994, BLM had the Rangeland Reform Program and wanted a way to quickly assess rangeland health. This is that full circle for me. I got involved in that, went back to the phase one watershed inventory that I had done the first at the beginning of my career. And a number of those indicators are now in the interpreting indicators of rangeland health, which has been not only used here, but translated internationally. This version now is version 5. And there's the core team that I started with, including Dave Pike, Pat Shaver, Jeff Herrick, Fee Busby. We have worked together 30 years and we're on version 5 now. And so to me, these relationships build good relationships and the collaboration you'll build as you move forward if you have those good relationships and develop new relationships, but maintain them because in the future, it's just going to mean you're that much ahead if you've already got the relationships to build the collaboration from.
Thanks, Mike. Also in the chat, what species do you think you had the most success developing with the Great Basin Native Plant Selection and Increase Project?
Oh, my favorite, without question, is the Anatone Blue Bunch wheatgrass, simply because of not just the success in the plots, but being involved in the fire rehabilitation program in Idaho and getting it out there, especially on these drier sites that have a lot of cheatgrass. And I'm not saying the other releases aren't good, but I don't know. That one to me, just seeing what it would do out at Orchard and seed into the cheatgrass areas was pretty impressive. So that, and then a lot of the native forbs, it's hard to pick one, but just get that component for its value to pollinators and the diversity it provides. I just always loved it when I went out to a rehab and I'd see the native forbs, coming out and being a part of that rehab. So I guess that's the favorites I can think of now.
That's great. Another question from the chat. Do you have any concerns about forage kochia becoming the new cure-all the way crested wheatgrass was before?
Yes. Again, the lesson learned in the Boise area was the slick spot peppergrass. It just grows in these little playas intermixed in the sagebrush, and the forage kochia would move into them. I think there's been I see forage kochia spread. We had monitoring, and the one I showed, Interstate 84, where the fire burned to it, we put monitoring plots not only in the green strip, but outside it to look to see if forage kochia would spread. And it didn't spread readily into the cheatgrass that much. However, if there was a fire in the cheatgrass, then that would provide an opening and it tended to spread. So yeah, I have concerns. I think that's all part of the analysis of, the benefits versus the potential damage it could cause. And so it's not a plant everywhere, do a really good evaluation and make sure, you don't create a bigger problem from, an introduced plant. Having said that, without question in my mind, it is the best fire resistant plant that we have. So Again, it's a kind of a local decision case by case.
Thank you. Restoration in the Mojave Desert has proved challenging and hasn't seen the success of the Great Basin. Do you have any thoughts on how to apply the Great Basin Restoration Initiative model to the Mojave Desert?
I think there has been a lot of restoration research. I know some of the cooperators on the Great Basin Restoration Initiative also worked in the Mojave. I think it's just a more challenging environment. Drier soils aren't probably as good as in the Great Basin. Precipitation events, the timing. So yeah, I just think it's a more challenging environment. I don't think it's for want of not having science or research looking at it. It's just a more difficult environment to do restoration in. I wish I could offer more, but I'm glad I worked in the Great Basin and not the Mojave, just because you do have a better chance for success.
Thanks. Can you speak to fuel break maintenance, especially with what's happening to federal agency capacity currently?
Yes. We made it clear from the beginning on green stripping that maintenance would be required. And I think if you would go back and look at, especially where we went along a road and did a green strip with, removing 300 feet of sagebrush, put fire-resistant plants, the realization was over time, sagebrush would probably come back in and the effectiveness would go down. So, yeah, I think I think probably the any fuel break, the maintenance, and I think early on the green strips, if you went back and looked at them, I think you'd see the majority weren't maintained and probably aren't as effective or may not even be effective at all anymore. So, yeah, I guess my advice, don't do fuel breaks unless you have kind of at least a commitment to do maintenance in the future. Uh, Put a big investment in. Let's maintain that investment.
Well, the next question kind of is related to that. Given the recent reduction in the federal workforce, where do you think the BLM could use the most support from outside groups?
Oh, kind of a answer of all of the above, but uh boy, that's a great question. I think there's so many things you do as a BLM employee that really aren't, you know, adaptable to being, a non-employee and helping other than, field tours and bringing in issues. But the other aspect too is just the volunteer aspect. If you're, you know, doing sagebrush seedling plantings or bitterbrush plantings, whether it's BLM or if it's a fish and game or whatever, just do as much as you can in terms of volunteering in that capacity and politically just supporting the agencies to your congressman and to the elected representatives uh, you know, to continue doing the job that we need. And I'll just add, to me, working for BLM wasn't just a job. This is land owned by the American people. And to me, it was just a way to kind of serve, I don't want to say the country, that's corny, but to kind of give back to the country because this is everybody's land. It's important. And uh, yeah, so any way you can volunteer in a capacity, I'd encourage that. And your voice counts, so I'd encourage contacting political representatives as well.
Well, that was the last question, and that is such a great way to close. Um, yes, I love that. A service to the land and the people. Um, Thank you so much, Mike. It's been so great hearing about your career and perspective, and thank you, audience, for all the great questions. There'll be when this webinar closes, there'll be a 3-question survey, and it really helps us if you take that survey. We'll post the webinar recording on our website, hopefully within the next week, and I will email everyone when that's posted. Yeah, and as Corey mentioned, Jean will be talking next week about the Elko front case study and using the data there to look at climate change and vegetation change. So be sure to join us for that if you can. Yeah, if you have any further questions, please reach out to me or Mike. And thank you all for attending the webinar. And thanks again, Mike, for the great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.